On a clear day in 1943, a pilot flying the eastern route from India to China could look down at the jagged snow-capped peaks of the Himalayas and navigate without a compass. He followed a glimmering metallic scar that wound through the jungle valleys and up the granite slopes. It was a path made of hundreds of crashed aircraft. The sun reflected off the scattered wings, the fuselages, and the tail sections of the C-46 Commandos and C-47 Skytrains that had failed to clear the ridgelines. This was the Aluminium Trail, a grim navigational aid formed by the wreckage of Allied transport planes. For the air crews of the Air Transport Command, it served as a terrifying reminder of the stakes. They were flying the Hump, a 500-mile gauntlet that pilots called the most dangerous air route in the world. They flew unarmed, often unescorted, through weather that could snap a wing spar in seconds over terrain where a bailout meant almost certain death. Yet, for 3 years, this suicidal route was the only lifeline for an entire nation. If the planes stopped, China would collapse. If China collapsed, millions of Japanese troops would be unleashed upon the American forces in the Pacific. This is the story of how a ragtag fleet of converted airliners and inexperienced crews built a bridge over the roof of the world. To understand why the Allies were forcing transport planes over 15,000-foot mountains, you have to look at the map of Asia in early 1942. For years, the Republic of China had been fighting a desperate war of survival against the Japanese Empire. By 1941, Japan controlled the entire Chinese coast, seizing every major port from Shanghai to Hong Kong. The industrial East was gone. The Chinese government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, had retreated deep into the interior to the mountain city of Chongqing. China was under siege, but it had one remaining artery to the outside world, the Burma Road. This was a legendary engineering feat, a 700-mile dirt track scratched out of the mountains by 200,000 Chinese laborers using hand tools. It wound from the railhead at Lasio in British-controlled Burma up through the mountains and into Kunming. Day and night, trucks rumbled up this road, bringing the fuel, ammunition, and medicine that kept the Chinese army alive. Then, in early 1942, the Japanese Imperial Army slammed the door shut, and in a lightning campaign, Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia, capturing Rangoon and cutting the Burma Road. China was now sealed off. The strategic implications were catastrophic for the United States. President Roosevelt knew that keeping China in the war was vital. If Chiang Kai-shek surrendered, the vast Japanese army bogged down in the Chinese interior would be free to redeploy to the Pacific Theater to fight the American Marines. The Allies needed to get supplies to China, but there was no way in by land or sea. The only option left was the air, and they would have to fly cargo from the tea plantations of Assam, India, over the eastern foothills of the Himalayas and into the high plateau of Kunming. It was an operation that had never been attempted in history. No one had ever tried to supply an entire theater of war solely by air, and they certainly hadn't tried to do it over the world's highest mountain range. The route was technically only 500 miles long, a routine flight for today's standards, but those 500 miles lay across the most treacherous terrain on the planet. Pilots called it the Hump, and the topography created a nightmare for aviation. The Brahmaputra Valley in India sat at only 90 feet above sea level. Just miles to the east, the mountain wall shot up instantly to 10,000 feet and then to 14,000 and higher. This massive barrier created its own weather system, and the moist, warm air from the Bay of Bengal would slam into the frozen high-altitude peaks, creating storms of unimaginable violence. Pilots reported updrafts and downdrafts moving at 5,000 feet per minute. A loaded transport plane could be sucked upward into the freezing overcast or smashed down toward the jungle canopy, regardless of what the pilot did with the controls. Turbulence was often severe enough to flip a heavy transport plane upside down. And worse was the icing. As planes climbed to clear the peaks, they entered clouds that were supercooled. Ice would accumulate on the wings in seconds, destroying the lift and weighing down the aircraft. The de-icing boots on the early planes were often useless against the speed of the buildup. Even today, modern planes tend to avoid this area of the world. And then there was the wind. The jet stream, unknown to science at the time, howled over the ridges at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. A pilot flying a slow-moving cargo plane could find himself effectively flying backward or blown hundreds of miles off course into Japanese-occupied territory. The route itself had two variations. There was the low hump to the south, where the mountains were lower, but this path flew dangerously close to Japanese fighter bases in Myitkyina. Then there was the high hump to the north. This route kept the planes out of range of the Japanese Zeros, but it forced them to climb over 16,000-foot peaks, pushing their unpressurized aircraft and oxygen-starved crews to the absolute limit. The operation began in April 1942 with a sense of chaotic desperation. The US Army Air Forces had no experience in strategic airlift, and they were making it up as they went along. The first unit to arrive was the 1st Ferrying Group, a collection of airline pilots and reservists who had been flying commercial routes just months before. They arrived in Assam to find nothing. The airfields were muddy strips cut through the tea bushes, and there were no hangars, no lights, and no navigation aids. The crews lived in bamboo bushes with dirt floors, battling dysentery, malaria, and the oppressive jungle heat. The aircraft they brought with them were Douglas C-47 Skytrains, the military version of the famous DC-3 airliner. The C-47 was one of the most reliable planes ever built, but it wasn't designed for the Himalayas. Its service ceiling with a full load was often lower than the mountains it had to cross. Pilots found themselves spiraling endlessly over the airfield, trying to gain enough altitude to scrape over the first ridge. Often, they couldn't make it. They would have to thread the needle, flying through narrow passes with jagged rock walls towering above their wings on both sides. Navigation was primitive. Maps of the area were marked unsurveyed or showed mountain peaks thousands of feet lower than they actually were. Pilots flew by dead reckoning, estimating their position based on speed and time, or by following rivers when the clouds broke. It was, as one historian noted, a barnstorming era. There were no fixed schedules and no real safety procedures. A pilot would load up his plane with as much gasoline or ammunition as he dared, take off, and hope for the best. Helping the Americans were the pilots of the CNAC, the China National Aviation Corporation. These were civilian pilots, Chinese and American, who had been flying these mountains for years. They knew the terrain intimately and taught the newcomers the saddlebacks and passes that a loaded plane could survive. But even with their help, the tonnage numbers were pathetic. In the first few months, the airlift was barely delivering enough supplies to keep the American air units in China operational, let alone supply the Chinese army. The loss rate was staggering, and in the monsoon season of 1943, planes were disappearing almost daily. They simply vanished into the jungle, leaving almost no trace. Search and rescue was nearly impossible in the dense canopy and vertical terrain, and if a crew bailed out, they faced a weeks-long trek just to get back to base. By the end of 1943, the Hump was failing. The tonnage was too low, the accident rate was too high, and the morale of crews was breaking. Washington was demanding 10,000 tons a month, and the airlift was delivering a fraction of that. The command was in disarray, and the pilots were exhausted. They needed a new plane, and they needed a commander who could turn a chaotic ferry run into a professional airline. They would get both, but the cost in blood was about to go up. The solution to the altitude problem arrived in the form of the Curtiss C-46 Commando, a massive twin-engine beast with a cavernous cargo hold and powerful engines that could lift it to 20,000 feet. It could carry twice the payload of the C-47 and handle the high altitude routes with ease. But the C-46 came with the slight caveat of being a death trap. It had been rushed into production without proper testing, and it arrived in India teeming with mechanical defects. The hydraulic systems leaked, the electrical systems failed, and most terrifyingly, the engines had a tendency to explode. The fuel lines in the wings were poorly vented, and when the plane climbed quickly to high altitude, the vapor lock would cause the fuel to spray onto the hot engine manifolds. Scores of C-46 simply burst into flames mid-air, often just after takeoff, with the crews calling it the flying coffin. Despite this, the tonnage had to increase. The man sent to force the numbers up was Brigadier General Thomas Hardin. Hardin was the former vice president of TWA, a hard-drinking, chain-smoking executive who flew his own planes and had zero tolerance for excuses. He arrived in the theater with a simple mandate: get the cargo to China no matter the cost. Hardin introduced night flying to the Hump. He pushed the crews to fly in weather that grounded the birds. He famously flew a mission himself, landed, and declared, "There is no weather on the Hump." He was ruthless. He once landed at a base, fired the commander on the spot for poor maintenance, and installed his replacement within 15 minutes. Under Hardin's brutal leadership, the barnstorming ended. He instituted strict flight paths and schedules, and the numbers eventually began to climb. By late 1943, the aircraft was finally pushing significant tonnage over the mountains. Hardin's philosophy was that the strategic necessity of the supplies outweighed the loss of the planes and men. In January 1944, there were 2 major crashes for every 1,000 hours flown. The pilots were pushed to the breaking point, flying fatigued and defective aircraft through impossible weather. But the supplies were getting through. By early 1944, General Hardin's ruthless push for tonnage had worked. Supplies were finally reaching China in significant quantities, but the cost was unsustainable. Crews flying the Hump began to report that on clear days, they didn't need navigation instruments. They could just follow the glint of sunlight reflecting off the wreckage of crashed planes scattered along the ridges below. They called it the Aluminium Trail. Imagine for a second that you're flying one of these missions and you have to endure the statistical probability of a crash. If you survive the impact, you are stranded in one of the most remote places on Earth, thousands of feet up in the Himalayas or deep in the dense, leech-infested jungles of Burma. Even today, with all the technology we have, the chances of you coming out alive in a situation like that is low. To survive, these airmen had to become hikers. Crews carried blood chits, flags printed with the Chinese nationalist flag, and a message in multiple languages promising a reward to anyone who helped them. They carried gold coins to bribe local tribes, and they carried .45 caliber pistols, mostly for morale. If you were lucky, you landed near friendly Kachin tribesmen who hated the Japanese and would guide you back to India. If you were unlucky, you landed near Japanese patrols or headhunters. And if you were really unlucky, you landed in the high peaks where the cold killed you before anyone even knew you were missing. In the summer of 1944, the Army Air Forces made a change. They relieved the hard-charging Hardin and brought in a man who would fundamentally change the nature of the military airlift, General William Tunner. Tunner was the opposite of a barnstormer. He was a cold, calculating logistician, and he saw the Hump as a business problem. Every plane on the side of a mountain was a plane not carrying cargo. He immediately stopped the cowboy culture and looked at the data and realized that most crashes were caused by pilot error or maintenance failure, not the Japanese. So he standardized everything. He implemented strict instrument flying procedures and created a production line maintenance system where specific mechanics worked on specific parts of the engine, just like a factory. He also realized the crews were terrified of the jungle, so he created a mandatory jungle indoctrination school. Before a pilot could fly a mission, he had to spend time in the bush learning how to find water, how to deal with leeches, and how to trade with locals. But his biggest move was to break the pilot's fatigue. He realized that crews were flying too many hours in terrible conditions. He brought in more men, rotated them frequently, and improved their living quarters. He basically turned a ragtag suicide squad into a professional airline. The results were immediate. The accident rate plummeted, and because fewer planes were crashing and more planes were serviceable, the tonnage skyrocketed. With Tunner's system in place, the Hump transformed. It became a terrifyingly efficient conveyor belt. The final piece of the puzzle arrived in late 1944, the Douglas C-54 Skymaster. This was the game changer. It had 4 engines, was reliable, and could carry a massive payload high above the worst of the weather. By 1945, planes were taking off from Indian bases every 72 seconds, 24 hours a day. They were hauling everything, and they flew in gasoline, artillery shells, and jeeps. They flew in mules for the ground troops, and they even flew in an entire truck, cut into pieces with torches loaded onto C-46s and welded back together in China. In July 1945 alone, the Hump airlift delivered 71,000 tons of cargo. To put that in perspective, that was more than the Burma Road ever delivered in its best month. The impossible airlift had become the primary artery of the war in Asia. The Japanese Air Force tried to stop them, but they were overwhelmed. By this point in the war, the Allies had total air superiority. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts roamed the skies, hunting Japanese interceptors, keeping the supply line secure. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the Hump operation shut down almost as quickly as it had started. The bases in India were abandoned and the bamboo towers rotted into the jungle. 3 years later, the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin. The US found itself needing to supply an entire city by air, and it seemed impossible to everyone except the men who had served in the Himalayas. The Air Force called back General William Tunner. Tunner simply opened his notebook from 1944 and applied the exact same conveyor belt tactics he had developed in the jungle. By the end, the Soviet Union ended their blockade as the resupply from the air rendered their blockade useless. So, was the Hump worth it? Historians still debate whether the supplies delivered actually changed the outcome of the war in China, but what isn't up for debate is the sheer human tenacity required to make it happen. It was a logistical miracle forged in the worst conditions imaginable. If you enjoyed this deep dive into aviation history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. We've got more stories of impossible engineering and military history coming your way, and make sure you let me know in the comments, would you have climbed into a C-46 in 1943? Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.